Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our later afternoon talk. I first met Jerry a little over 20 years ago at Fort Union Trading Post in North Dakota. When I went to figuring out how I was going to introduce him, I realized that his accomplishments are such that I had to have crib notes. But before I do that, a lot of us get together during these gatherings and symposium, and we have breakfast together at the motels. And for years, I've been hearing people talk about someone should do an updated biography of Jim Bridger. Well, Jerry actually did it. And his book has just recently come out, and it's getting very good reviews, and I highly recommend it. And I'm going to switch to the formal introduction. Jerry Enzler is an author, historian, and award-winning museum curator. He was the founder of the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, where he is president emeritus. Over the years, Jerry has created museum exhibits and films that have been viewed by over 4 million people. His new biography of James Bridger, which is titled Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West, is an important addition to the literature of the fur trade. And without further ado, here's Jerry.
Well, good afternoon. It's a real delight to be here. And first, among all things, I want to say thank you to about half the people in this room who either encouraged me or corrected me or gave me some information or helped me bring this book to fruition. So thank you very, very much. I've been coming here off and on for 24 years and really enjoying it. Jim Bridger is, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable frontiersmen in American history, on par with Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett and Kit Carson. This book tells a story of great adventure and of great challenges. Bridger faced challenges throughout, probably because he was so adventuresome. He just went here, went there, and then there was usually some challenge to save his life or others, or simply to get out of the fix that he was in. It's also a book about loss. Bridger was married 3 times, and his first wife was a Flathead or Salish woman, and she passed away after not a very long time in marriage. And then his second wife was a Ute woman named Chipeta, and she only had 1 child with Bridger, and she passed away shortly after that birth of Virginia. And then his third wife was Mary Shoshone. And I don't agree that the family and Alter and some other authors say that his Flathead wife was the daughter of Chief Insula, and his Shoshone wife was a daughter of Chief Washakie. And that may be so, and it comes down in family tradition, but there's really no documentation for any of that. They also say that he was probably married by a Catholic priest, and there's no documentation of that either. So, you know, history is a moving target. And so what you'll see is my interpretation of what I think is the story of Jim Bridger. Bridger was, you may know this too, or you may not, Bridger was one of the first figures proposed for Mount Rushmore. It was going to be in the 1920s, it was going to be a monument where they're going to carve these colossal figures of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, Jedediah Smith, John C. Fremont, Red Cloud, Bridger, and Buffalo Bill Cody. And then when the ultimate sculptor arrived on the scene, he thought it'd be better to put in the 4 presidents, and that's what we have now for our Mount Rushmore. Bridger was significant in 4 different areas of history, and most of the people in this room are very well aware of his role as a fur trader and explorer, and that's one of the 4 areas where he really excelled. A second area is along the Oregon and the California Trail, and in particular, establishing Fort Bridger and developing his role in history in that segment of America's story. The third one is he was a guide for map makers and a guide for several scientists from the Smithsonian. And the fourth was he was a guide for the U.S. Army and thousands and thousands of soldiers. So he had a very long life active on the career and in the West. And you might consider this being active, or maybe it's just the challenge of an 8-year-old boy. But when he was 8, his family moved from Richmond to the American Bottom, which is just across from St. Louis. And that was not really a very safe time to travel, because that was when America was in its second war with Great Britain, and it was the War of 1812. And so as the Bridgers moved west, so did the battles move west. Michilimackinac, Detroit, Chicago, and so they were, a couple hundred miles south of those battles. And the danger really wasn't so much that the British forces were going to capture this American family. It would be that the indigenous peoples who had been taken advantage of by American settlers, and so much land had been taken from them, they were siding with the British and, being at war, legally allied with or philosophically allied with the British. There was a lot of raiding of American settlers and American travelers. So that was at the age of 8. Bridger's parents died. His mother died first when he was 12, and his father died, it's said by Dodge that he was 13. But when Bridger was 12 years old, he was apprenticed to Philip Creamer. And Creamer has been described by others that he was a blacksmith in St. Louis. And he was more than that. He was a celebrated gunsmith, one of the most significant ones in the region, in Illinois, near Cahokia. Now, he did do some blacksmithing or gunsmithing also in St. Louis, but the point is the previous biographers, did not catch that at all in their work. And so I was kind of disturbed when I saw what had been written about Jim Bridger. And then when I started to see how poorly some of it was written, and 2, how much more information hopefully could be gathered. Well, it was a pretty hard thing to gather information, because Bridger left very few letters, and they were all dictated letters. He never wrote a letter, to my knowledge, and he did not leave them. But a lot of other people wrote about Bridger and their encounters with him. And so I've traveled across the country several times over the span of 40 years. While I was working at the museum in Dubuque, I was in the side. Some people golf, some people watch the Match Madness. I go to libraries and archives and collect more information about Jim Bridger, and hopefully not anymore. But during that War of 1812, the Bridger family, they were at the American Bottom, and the Potawatomis were very much dangerous enemies to all those settlers. The governor of Illinois Territory sent all of his children back to Kentucky. I think it was Kentucky, because he did not want his children actually being in the state during the War of 1812. Bridger and his family, they didn't have any options in that way. But I bring that up because the war now is over, and the Potawatomi, they need a lot of help. They need arms, they need plows, they need to fix their equipment. So Bridger was apprenticed to Philip Creamer, and it's been known that he worked at the Illinois Indian Agency, but it's never really been documented where that was, and that was in Peoria. It was in Peoria, and it was a village mainly of the Potawatomis who had been threatening a lot of Bridger and his neighbors throughout that time. So Bridger started that when he was 12 and continued that when he was 13. I don't think there's any support to say that he was an apprentice for 4 years to Philip Creamer. I mean, that's typically what would happen. An apprentice would be freed when they're 18. So he might have been, but there's no real documentation. There's documentation that when he was 14, he also was living 2 miles away from Turkey Hill, which is very close to Cahokia, Illinois. But imagine this, then you're 12 or you're 13, and you're living kind of side by side of a Potawatomi village. And you can start to see Bridger's future life, where he's going to be a trader with indigenous peoples. And he's going to build a fort and trade there. And he's going to build a outfitting store at New Santa Fe. And he's going to be in a place where there are Native peoples. My personal view is that Bridger was searching for home for much of his life. I mean, he lost his parents He went out west. I think he did find his home in the west, and in 1855 he felt somewhat forced, or 1853, to move away from his Fort Bridger, and he regretted that, and he was internally angry for the rest of his life. I talked to a lot of people about how upset he was that his Fort Bridger had been taken away from him, and I hope to get into that. So Bridger's a unique character. He's different than a lot of other mountaineers in that he spent so much of his time out in the West. And you could say from 1822 to 1868, he was extraordinarily active in the Western America story. And for that alone, he's significant. The fact of his accomplishments that he made during that time make him, in my mind, extraordinary. But these were extraordinary people too. The mountaineers, as that's what Irving talks about the mountaineers. Well, before I do that, I want to give a little bit of a reading. Okay, so Bridger is 17. If Bridger went to the banks of the Mississippi River, he could imagine it flowing hundreds of miles south to New Orleans. He's on the Illinois shore, and to the Gulf of Mexico. He could look north and wonder where was the source of the Mississippi River. It hadn't yet been found by Schoolcraft in 1820. But he was destined to follow the chocolate snake called Missouri, whose fangs reached the far west into the Rocky Mountains. Bridger couldn't read, so the words of the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette that February day in 1822 must have been read to him or told to him by another. Almost every boatman and trapper in St. Louis was talking about what the ad said. William Ashley and Andrew Henry were looking for 100 enterprising young men to follow the Missouri upriver to the far northwest to trap beaver. They planned to travel by keelboat for 1,500 miles and then cover another 1,000 miles by horse, or canoe, or keelboat. Like most who could not read, Bridger would have put his X next to his name in the ledger. His fortunes were now tied with the company, and he could make $1 or more for every beaver that he caught and skinned. Some trappers saw themselves building their fortunes on beaver pelts. Wives and sisters saw their men disappearing to a land of Indians and grizzlies, perhaps never to return. Did Bridger sign up for such an adventure to escape the expectations and maybe the exclusions of civilization, because he could neither read nor write? Was it to make his fortune? Or was it to take the measure of the new land and make it his own? So it's not proven significantly or undoubtedly, but it's assumed that Bridger went up on the first keelboat in 1822. And James White remembered that from his knowing him in 1822, but also from visiting Bridger in 1849 at Fort Bridger. They spent a half day together talking about those early days where Bridger and Beckworth and White all knew each other at that time. There's a lot of material in this fur trade era is mostly up to date, mainly because of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. There's been so much scholarship that I've been able to incorporate that. But there are some new things. For example, the killing of Emil and the 2 arrowheads in the back of Jim Bridger. I don't think it's none of the Bridger biographers have noted this, but they were led. The Blackfeet Indians were led by an Indian named Eagle Ribs, and Eagle Ribs he carried not 1 but 2 medicine bundles, as well as a burning hatred for the Americans. He boasted that, and this is a quote from Catlin, George Catlin, who painted his picture in 1832, about the same time that he attacked Bridger. He had 8 scalps, which he said he had taken from the heads of trappers and traders with his own hand. So you know the story that Loretta was a trapper and his wife was a Blackfoot woman, and she had been traded off. And then when she saw the Blackfeet, she went out. There's 2 stories. One is that she went immediately to run to her brother, The other is that Bridger had her come out with him as an interpreter. And I followed the second. So seeing movement among the chiefs and thinking it might be treachery, Bridger cocked his rifle. Eagle Ribs was extending his hand. He heard it and he grabbed the barrel of Bridger's rifle and he twisted it downward and Bridger's rifle discharged into the earth. Bridger struggled with Eagle Ribs over the rifle and Bridger's horse turned. Blackfeet drew his bow and let fly and the arrow drove deep into Bridger's lower back. A second arrow pierced Bridger's back also. Eagle Ribs then wrested the rifle out of Bridger's hands and struck him with it. And Bridger recalled in the 1860s, he said he remembered the time that he was wounded and then, quote, he was hit so hard as almost to break his neck. That was Bridger's memory of that event. Other new information, which comes from someone who's actually right here, a descendant of somebody who's right here at the Rendezvous celebration. Jonathan Keeney came out to the mountains in 1831 to work with Bridger. And he remembered the operation in 1835 when Marcus Whitman took they were able to pull the first arrowhead out of Bridger's back, but they couldn't get the second one. Marcus Whitman comes to the 1835 rendezvous, and he's practiced as a doctor. He paid like $2 for his anatomy class and $4 for his other class, a little bit more than medical school costs today, but nevertheless a good doctor. So Keeney writes, the doctor cut deep into the sores, he had actually as both, around the arrow points. With a sharp knife, and he inserted some instrument like a pair of pincers. The point had struck a bone and had, quote, partly clinched around a rib, which required the strength of 2 men to pull it out. And Bridger had to be held down. He bore the operation with only a slight groan or two, and the point actually straightened out when it gave way and came out of his body. That information came to me, I was maybe 2 days away from sending it in, sending the manuscript in for final. And Jim Hardy called and said, I got something new that you might want to put in. And it went right in, of course. And that's why I say thanks to everybody who's here who are always so helpful. But Bridger was outstanding also along the Oregon and California Trail. And his first Fort Bridger was along the Green River in 1841. And that was about the same time that his partner Frapp was killed. The Sioux and the Shoshone were at tremendous odds with each other, and the Sioux wanted to push further west and claim some of the Shoshone territory. And so there was a loss of several men, including Henry Frapp, or Frabe, who was Bridger's partner. Bridger's first partner in a fort was Henry Frabe. So it was Bridger and Frabe were the partners. I think it might have been Frabe and Bridger, actually. So when he died, and Bridger saw how aggressive the Sioux were to attack the Shoshone, that area, he decided 2 things: to send his oldest daughter, Mary Ann, up to the Marcus and Narcissa Whitman missionary in Oregon, and secondly, to move Fort Bridger further west. And so the second Fort Bridger was built in around 1842, and the Fremont group saw that, and that was up on a bluff over the existing one. And then in 1843, they built the third and the final Fort Bridger. And Bridger's fort became a very significant site, but no nearly the kind of goods and values and value that Fort Laramie, for example, or Fort Hall. You saw if you were the last talk, you saw the tremendous amount of goods that were sold there. Bridger and Vasquez had trouble with that, his partner Louis Vasquez, and they didn't always get the backing that they wanted. And they were opposed by Laidlaw, who was up in Fort Union, and he was urging the Chateau family not to fund the Bridger and Vasquez enterprise, maybe because they justly thought they weren't good handlers of money, or maybe because they were strong competition to them. It's hard to tell either one. But Bridger had a significant role in the Oregon and California Trail. He also had a very significant role in guiding map makers. And a number of people who were way ahead of him in that regard was Kit Carson and Tom Fitzpatrick, who guided for Fremont, and Fitzpatrick, who guided others along the Oregon Trail, and many other mountaineers got into the guiding of westward travelers. Bridger's first real episode of that came when Howard Stansbury arrived in 1849. When Bridger built his fort, he was west of the Continental Divide. And so therefore he was actually in Mexico. And that was 1843. When the Church of Latter-day Saints moved from Nauvoo to Salt Lake City in that area, they were also moving into Mexico territory. But the War of 1848, 46 to 48, that changed that. And the treaty ending that meant the United States was going to pay a significant amount, but probably not what it was worth for the whole, what we call now the Southwest United States. It was Spanish territory, then it was Mexican territory. Before all that, it was indigenous people, Mexican and Spanish, and then American. And so suddenly there was a body of people who wanted to get away from the rules and regulations of people who were oppressing them, sometimes called Mormons. They wished to be for now the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They, and of course, they outnumbered the very few number of people who lived at Fort Bridger. So Bridger then became part of Utah territory. And the church actually wanted to be the state of Deseret, and Congress said, no, you'll be the territory of Utah. And there was a lot of conflict about that. And some of the major issues were one was the influence. Bridger was very influential among the Shoshone and the Ute and other indigenous peoples who were in that region. Brigham Young wanted to be very influential, and he was extraordinarily influential. He was. I mean, I think he was the American Moses. I mean, the number of people that he was able to bring to that region is just extraordinary. But he was leading a theocracy. He believed that he was getting his message and inspiration from God, and that's part of the reason or part of the inspiration for laying down the laws of that territory, which is the territory of the United States. And so there's a lot of conflicts and a lot of opinions on one side or the other. There's one incident which isn't new, but it's interesting. In 1849, Vasquez and Bridger were concerned that there were Indians maybe who were upset with the Mormon settlements because they started doing a number of settlements around Salt Lake City and further away. And so Vasquez wrote a letter to Brigham Young. And so Brigham Young read it aloud or had it read aloud with his council of people, and they were taking notes and everything. And after reading the letter of warning, Brigham Young said, well, you know, Vasquez, I'm paraphrasing here, Vasquez is a man of truth, but Jim Bridger is another matter. And if Jim Bridger knew that there was someone coming to warn us that 4,000 Indians were about to attack us, Bridger would probably slit that man's throat before he could come and warn us of this danger. No real justification for it, but there it goes. So there was Brigham Young he's a wonderful figure a person to think about. It's said that he said, yes, I can be very profane and I swear a lot, but usually it's only from the pulpit. Anyway, there was tremendous resources that Bridger and Vasquez had there, especially with the discovery of gold in 1848 and the gold rush in 49. I mean, here you're talking about the ledgers, for example, at Fort Laramie, they're documenting over 50,000 people passing Fort Laramie. Now, they're not all going to go down. Some are going to take the Sublette Cutoff. Some are going to take the Great Salt Lake Trail, and some are going, you know, maybe another route. But it's an enormous growth. And so by this time, the Bridger and Vasquez were probably doing in wholesale, I mean, in gross income, probably well over $10,000 a year. They also were operating a ferry on the Green River, as were several others, and they were significantly increasing their profits from that. So with the government of the territory of Utah suddenly becoming formal, they passed laws, for example, that said you had to vend the brand, and I had to call Clay to ask what that meant, and he told me all about it and gave me some notes on where to find more about it. But what would happen was this. This was like 1851, 1852. People would go through Fort Bridger and they'd trade their weary oxen or their horses for fresh horses or oxen or whatever they were looking for. who had been arrested, and and Bridger made a lot of money. There was one time, about 2 years later, Bridger actually sold to one company $6,000 worth of livestock that he had on his site. But never, so it's over 100 miles from Fort Bridger to Salt Lake City. So these immigrants now who are anxious to get to the gold fields, they enter Salt Lake City, and the authorities there are allowed to look and see whether the brand had been vended. In other words, had the old Bridger brand been taken off, and had they got a new brand, or did they have real proof? And they said, well, this is just what, I did a swap with Bridger 100 miles back. And they said, well, we're going to confiscate your animals. Well, what recourse do we have? They said, well, you can sue Bridger and Vasquez for financial means, and then you can stick around, and we'll go out there to Fort Bridger, and we'll try and get that money. It came out to an enormous sum, maybe $20,000 for 9 horses or something like that. They actually settled for like $900, I think, for the 4 or 5 horses. So there was a conflict between someone who was living the days of the rendezvous, or freedom of not even being in the United States. You're in Mexico, or you don't even know where you are. Hudson Bay thinks it's theirs. U.S. thinks it's theirs. Shoshone and Blackfeet each think it's theirs. That kind of early period to now a period of settlement that the Church of Latter-day Saints had brought in. So there was continued rivalry, and in 1853, Brigham Young worked with the federal judiciary judge to have a charge of treason against the United States brought against Jim Bridger. And this is new information which has just been out, just been available to me anyway in the past, year or so. And so there's Gowan's book describes it pretty well, but he doesn't describe it. There was that explicit treason against the United States, Jim Bridger. So, that's punishable definitely by imprisonment, maybe a very long term, could even be punishable by death. So they gathered a posse, a very large posse, and came out, and Bridger heard about it, and he escaped being caught. And he did feel, though, that he had no choice but to leave. And that's when Vasquez had left the fort in 1852. And so he went back to and actually bought a property in Kansas City, Missouri, near what they call Dallas, or the Thatcher Farm, or north of New Santa Fe, or Little Santa Fe, it's sometimes known. And so he was actually still partnered with Bridger. And so he was actually holding horses and other livestock to keep them, so they could be bought by people who are heading west, either on the Santa Fe Trail or, going other locations. And so he was already gone, but Bridger was there. And so Bridger had to leave. And so then came a lot of schemes start running through, because Brigham Young was the head of the U.S., or no, excuse me, not the U.S., but the Utah Territorial Army, as well as governor of. And so there was, Bridger didn't have much choice, but he had to leave. And he ultimately came back. It was 1853 he left. He came back in 1855. And he did settle and did sell on behalf of Vasquez's lawyer and his own self. And talking with Jay Buckley, who read the book, he said, Jerry, yours is going to be the first biography that admits that Bridger and Vasquez did indeed sell their property to the Mormons, and the Mormons didn't just take it. They did kind of force the sale, and the total amount provided was, I think, $9,000. The value of the stock that they confiscated and took, and goods and everything else, was about 7,600, or no, 7,400 something. So the net price of buying the land, the property wasn't worth much, but the retail business that was there, that was doing a significant amount of money each year, they ultimately got only about $1,500 for it. So somewhat underpaid. In fact, they said they were underpaid. So the Church of Mormons actually gave him an extra $1,000. So all was well, but Bridger knew that he couldn't go back there. But he had played a very significant role there. But before he actually had to sell out, he was a guide for Howard Stansbury. And Stansbury, right after the Mexican War, the U.S. Army said, we need to extend our forts now. We've had Fort Laramie. We need more forts. We need a fort maybe in the Utah or what's now Utah or Western Wyoming area. We need some down south, towards Santa Fe. And so that was the U.S. role is to start establishing more forts throughout the West. And so Howard Stansberry, who's a topographer, and he was going to make a map of Salt Lake and also wanted to find a shortcut from Fort Bridger to Salt Lake. Wilson, who was the Indian agent, and the third man was John Gunnison, who was on with Stansberry. All three of them said this Fort Bridger site would be a perfect location. This is 1849 for another U.S. fort. So, just as the U.S. got Fort Laramie, they were thinking the U.S. should buy Fort Bridger, and Bridger would take the proceeds. They would establish a military fort there. That never happened. But it was a very significant place. But Bridger had a unique role in terms of trying to deal with leaders, topographers, and people who were making maps. Stansberry, for example, they wanted to go through, instead of following the regular route, what's called now the Mormon route, they were going to take some shortcuts. And Bridger said, no, don't go through that pass. Well, Stansberry insisted on doing it. And no, you should go this way. No, you shouldn't. And so then at the end, Bridger actually confided in someone, and this is newly published too. He said, I don't know if I'll ever work for another topographer again. I really do not want to be guiding anyone for the U.S. Army with the way I was treated, the way I was ignored, the way they just went their own way anyway. So it's an insight. And that happened again with Stansberry on the way back in 1850 when they went across the Overland Trail, what became the Overland Trail, which Ashley had gone in 1824-25. The Cherokees had gone in 1849. Bridger ran into the same kind of pushback from Reynolds. And Captain Reynolds wanted to connect the headwaters of the Wind River to the headwaters of the Yellowstone River. And Bridger said, well, the only way you do that is you cross the Continental Divide to the west side, then you go north a little bit, you cross the Continental Divide back to the east side. I'm looking at it if I'm the map here, to get to the headwaters of the Yellowstone. The Three Forks, for example, the Madison or the Yellowstone River itself. And Reynolds insisted, no, we can see. I can see it clearly on my map. These rivers are close. We'll be able to go right across. Well, they reached a sheer rock wall, and Reynolds finally admitted. Well, Bridger says, see, I told you a bird couldn't even fly over there without taking its own grub along. So that was something that perplexed Bridger throughout his career. General Connor in 1865, Fetterman when he was during Red Cloud's War, when he was saying that he could go in and defeat the Lakota Indians. He wasn't always believed, but he was greatly respected. I'm going to read a little bit about what people have said about Bridger. One is, and I started to talk about this earlier, and this is Irving's description of a mountaineer. A totally different class of people has now sprung up. The mountaineers, the traders and trappers, and we're talking about 1833, Bonneville. The traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback, heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is perhaps no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. And to think, we're reenacting all that today, all that excitement. People, I talked about the Three Forks here. At the 1837 rendezvous, the rendezvous, went from 1825 to 1840. In 1837, William Drummond Stewart brought out Alfred Jacob Miller to document that. And there was also an artist or a writer there by the name of David Brown. He was a trapper, but he actually published his works in 1835 with this story. On the right of Captain Stewart sat, or rather squatted in Oriental fashion, one of the most remarkable men in this remarkable assemblage. This was Jim Bridger, the leader of the beaver hunting parties, who had a thorough acquaintance with the whole mountain region, from the Russian settlements to the Californias. Wow. And every nook by hidden lake and unfrequented stream. He had a complete and absolute understanding of the Indian character based on his own large experience. To some, his bravery was unquestionable, his horsemanship equally so, and as to his skill with a rifle, he has been known to kill 20 buffaloes by the same number of consecutive shots. So that kind of praise kept coming in towards Bridger's way. Bridger really didn't know about it. He wasn't reading the Cincinnati Atlas in 1845. He wasn't reading textbooks, but I think it might have been Talbot who came. Well, no, somebody a little bit later. But they came and they said, "I've now arrived at Fort Bridger, that same fort that I read about in my school book when I was a youngster." At the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty, this is written by the editor of the Missouri newspaper, and he's talking about Bridger. "This man is a perfect original and has traversed the mountains east to west and from the northern boundary to the Gila River. He is not an educated man, but seems to have an intuitive knowledge of the topography of the country, the course of streams, the direction of the mountains, and is never lost." Some hyperbole there, I think. "Wherever he may be, when the party of trappers wish to move from one stream to another, or cross the mountains to any stream or place, or when lost or uncertain of the proper direction, they would always appeal to Bridger. He would throw his gun carelessly over his shoulder, survey the country a while with his eye, and then strike out on the course." So there's a lot of people who wrote about Bridger and how unique they thought he was. There was a man named Stevenson. We might talk about him tonight in our film series. Come at 7 o'clock. We're going to talk about Hugh Glass. We're going to see some segments of movies. Stevenson, in 1886, he's sitting at the castle of the Smithsonian, and he gets a letter from a professor in Wisconsin. And the professor has all these questions about Jim Bridger, and one of them was about Hugh Glass. But before he answered the question, he said, "Bridger and I hunted and tented together, he for game as meat, and I in the capacity as assistant naturalist in quest of mammals and birds for the Smithsonian Institution." He also says, "I studied Bridger, quote, almost as an object of natural history." Bridger's memory was an encyclopedia. He had a vivid and evidently accurate recollection of the details of events connected, and he goes on describing that. But one of the challenges, again, was that during backing up, 1862, gold is discovered in Montana and Idaho. And a lot of miners then are taking off just west of Fort Laramie, then they're heading north on what John Bozeman was going to be calling, or became known as, the Bozeman Trail. And Bridger knew that was not safe. It was not safe for the nation. It wasn't safe for those miners. And so he said, there is another route. I've been on it. I've mapped it with Reynolds. The problem, Reynolds had never really printed his map yet. Reynolds from 1861 to 66 was fighting the Civil War and never did the map. So the map of that area was in Bridger's head and very few other places. So Bridger said, and he got permission from the commander at Fort Laramie to be relieved of any scouting duties and to take the immigrants, or the miners, along through the Crow country. So they were going to go on the west side of the Bighorn Mountains, and Bozeman was going on the east side. And the difference is you got the Crow on the west side, and on the east side, you've got the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. So in that first year, 1864, 2,500 people approximately followed the Bridger Trail. And Bridger himself took 2 of those, but they all kind of followed that same route. 1,500 took the Bozeman Trail. But Bridger's trail was a little bit drier, and there wasn't as much to graze on for the horses. And it was a little bit more work. But Bridger still believed firmly in that would actually save lives and stop wars. The US Army didn't agree, and the miners didn't agree. This is the middle of the Civil War, and the US Treasury needed gold. It was a matter, they were printing, greenbacks, which were not backed by gold, like crazy, and they had enormous debt. So this was not only in the interest of miners, but in the interest of the US government, that they needed to make sure that gold, was continued to be mined as efficiently as possible and be part of the national economy. The result was 3 years of war because they didn't listen to Bridger and should have gone by way of through the Crow territory. And the Crow wanted him. The Crow, an earlier group went through, and the leader at the time said, "Where's Bridger? We haven't seen Bridger for years. We need to see our friend Bridger," who was known as Cassidy to the Crow, which means blanket chief. To his friends, he was known as Old Gabe. Even when he was in his young 30s, he was Old Gabe. And to the Lakota, he was known as Big Throat because he had goiter and it was very big, a very big neck. And so his name was Big Throat. And so when Bozeman and some of his men wanted to go, Red Cloud stopped them and some Red Cloud's men. And they said, "Go the Bridger route, go the route of the blanket chief." And so there was this tremendous conflict for the whole nation. Are they going to go through the Crow territory to reach this new gold find, or are they going to go through Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho? And you may know or you may not know what happened, and I'm not going to tell you because you really should get the book. It's great. I read it, and I recommend it. But I'll just say at the end, there's lots of really interesting conflicts. Okay, so one soldier summarized this issue. And then I'm going to stop for questions because I bet you have one or two. So he's describing the period from 1865, 66, 67, 68. Jim Bridger was with us all the summer of 1866, up until late in the fall. If Colonel Carrington and the officers had followed the advice of Bridger, I do not think there would have been nearly as many of our men killed. He told the officers not to follow the Indians and to send more men on escort duty, but they thought he was old and did not know anything about Indian warfare. So he really led a long, successful life to a point where he was so old that people didn't recognize the value and the knowledge that he had, and he was willing to share. But it's a fascinating story. So I'm open for questions. Yes, sir.
Did his education, lack of education, have any interference with his business dealings?
He seems to be very good with numbers. I mean, he was, even after Vasquez went south or went west or east rather to Kansas City, he was still, I mean, he knew how to do a trade very well. And he knew how to trade, one well-rested horses for two tired horses. I mean, some of that's kind of common sense. But he certainly hurt him in terms of doing any written acknowledgments or written documents. I mean, there's the only known record of Bridger's, I'll say two. There's one printed Jim Bridger trapper north of Fort Bridger, 1844, and Bridger could not have done that. He might have been able to trace it, but someone once said that even if he was trying to trace the letters of his name, that he would have had trouble. But he definitely had trouble, reading and writing. But because, and also whenever he found somebody who could help him, he did lean upon them, whether it was a clerk like Denig, who wrote a letter in 1843 saying he wanted to have supplies from the Chateau family. So he valued education, and he sent his daughter Marianne up to the Whitman mission, and unfortunately she died as a result of circumstances after the Whitman massacre. He sent the rest of his children to be educated in St. Charles, just maybe 10 or 20 miles west of St. Louis. And for a while, until he moved back when he left his fort, they were at those, actually the women, the girls, the daughters were like in convent schools. And one of those schools still exists today. And the guys they were going to school, the sons, but they weren't, sleeping overnight and being part of a religious group. Another question. By the way, I really enjoyed reading Vestal's book, 1946. And that book by the 1990s had sold over 93,000 copies. Tremendously well written in terms of excitement. poorly written in terms of its sensibility. One, it's not really that historically valuable. And two, he uses the term cussed Indians 22 times, not only in the voice of trappers, but in his own voice as an author, talking about, Cecil Alter's book. His best one is the 1951 book, which is very 550 words. It's good because Alter didn't synthesize it. He just gave the whole quote, which means that's what we want as historians. Every time he tried to synthesize, he usually made a mistake. So, I mean, you can read those books if you'd like, but I wouldn't recommend that they're going to be totally accurate. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's two known photographs of Jim Bridger. Do we know when those were taken, by who, and where they are today with the originals?
Yeah, this one was taken in the 1860s, 1863, 64, perhaps. Let's see, this is the one I think is, well, I should know, one of them is in Nebraska and one of them is in Kansas. And this is the one where he's older, and you can see a lot of wrinkles under his chin, and that's when I think the goiter actually went down. Goiter is often caused from having not enough iodine, or iodine or salt is a remedy to not have that. There's another book, a picture in the book, and I mentioned it, Stevenson in 1886. So in that letter, he's writing to Professor Davis in Madison. And he said, I not only know a lot about Bridger, and I hunted and trapped, et cetera, but I'm sending you a photograph from my own personal collection. And it was actually a photograph taken about 1856 or 7. And maybe at the time when Bridger was meeting with Campbell in Campbell's banking office, and the question came up, who discovered Great Salt Lake? And G.K. Warren was one who wanted to know, and Bridger guided G.K. Warren, and also Ferdinand Hayden, who had just recently, before he acquainted with Bridger, he had discovered dinosaur fossils in the United States. But William Henry Jackson, you saw one of his images in the last talk, he took this 1856-57 photograph of Bridger. He did a process where they print it like half or faintly on a hard surface, and then you rub over it in charcoal. And so the one I have in the book is the one that then he did approximately 1874. And you can tell that because the original image, the pants are just plain, but in the 1874, and the ones in the book, William Henry Jackson made like a corduroy pants, which in the 1830s, they were called pantaloons, and I'm enclosing a pair of pantaloons. Please give this to Jim Bridger, but I don't know what they called it in the 60s and 70s. And so I found that image at the Madison, Wisconsin State Historical Society of Wisconsin, and the original is at the Smithsonian. And so I asked to see that or learn more about it, and they have it identified as Kit Carson. And so I was explaining to them, our museum is Smithsonian affiliate, and so I thought that would give me a way in with the curator. No, not at all. When I finally did talk to the curator just by email, she said, well, we'll make a notation that thought to be Kit Carson may be doubtful. But so the one that's on this, it's not always on display, but it's in the collection of the Smithsonian, is labeled as Kit Carson. But it's the picture that you'll find maybe 3/4 of the way through the book, which was a William Henry Jackson modification of an 1857 photograph. So short answer, 1860s for this one, and late 1850s for the other.
Jerry, I loved your description of Bridger riding the rapids through the canyon at Bad Pass. It was marvelous. My question is in regards to the site of the first 2 Fort Bridgers. Have those been identified, and has there been any archaeological work there?
Did you say archaeologically identified? I don't really know. I don't think they had the one on the green. I don't think that has been identified. It's very likely that Dudley might have done something. Dudley Gardner, who's an archaeologist at Fort Bridger. I'm going to see him at Labor Day weekend, and I'll ask him that question. What Jim's referring to, You know, Bridger, as I said, at 12 and 13, he was living adjacent to the Potawatomis. When he was 17 is probably when he signed up. He was March 17th, he turned 18. So when the boat left first week of April, he was 18 by then. When he was 20, he was the first Euro-American to actually see or identify that Great Salt Lake was really a lake of salt by tasting it. Others had seen that lake, but I believe he's the first Euro-American to identify that this was actually a salt lake. In 1821, then, coming out of the 1825 rendezvous, Ashley and Jedediah Smith had this enormous quantity, I think it was over $50,000 worth of pelts, and they were going to take the Bighorn River north and then go back, go down by boat to St. Louis. And so they got to what's called Bad Pass, and Ashley wanted someone to go through that route to see whether they could float their cargo, float their pelts through. And so Bridger volunteered for that, just like he had volunteered to follow the course of the Bear River. And so he's 21 years old, and he built a raft, and he went through, and it was much more turbulent than it is today. You know, it's been dammed up and everything. But it's a magnificent thing. And back in 1805, there was a French-Canadian trader who was talking to the Crow, and they said, "Oh, there's an evil Manitou, an evil spirit up there, and you can't go there. That is Bad Pass. You cannot." It was both a bad pass to go by land close to the river, but it was definitely bad to try and go by water. And Bridger did go by water, and it was a pretty exciting thing. And then also, when he was still 21 and Fitzpatrick was 26, the Bannocks stole horses, and so there needed to be a group that went after to try and retrieve those horses. Fitzpatrick and Bridger both said, we'll lead that, and so they did as a co-leadership, a 21-year-old and a 26-year-old, and they led the group. And when they arrived to the Bannock village, they saw their horses. So Fitzpatrick said, well, we'll stay somewhat back, and we'll do a barrage of fire onto the camp to frighten them. Bridger, you're going to lead the men who go in and actually untie the horses or cut the ropes and leap on them and race away with them and take some of their horses as well, which he did at 21. So he's done, I mean, think of yourself at 21, or think of your children at 21, what they've done, and then what the things that Bridger had volunteered for by the time he was 21 years old. All those things, made him become extraordinarily comfortable with living that kind of dangerous and dynamic life.
Yeah, a lot of authors have written that Jim Bridger was a teller of the tall tales and stuff, especially up in the Yellowstone region. You've heard ones about the petrified bird singing petrified songs in the Obsidian Cliff. Mm-hmm. Is there any documentation of what ones that he really did tell?
Yeah, there are a number of documentations, and I do put them in the book. Lee Whittlesey, some of you know, he's been to some of these rendezvous here. And by the way, Lee said, he told me, if I could meet one person in history, I think it would be Jim Bridger. I think he would be the most interesting character that I would want to meet. Lee said, he said, you got to be very careful because there is no documentation of petrified forests in Yellowstone from Jim Bridger in the boundaries of Yellowstone. So there's some documentation of other places where he's, his storyline is something like, I was in these petrified forests and everything was petrified. The petrified birds were in the air, not even moving, and they were singing petrified songs, and everyone. And there's another one where, they fell off a cliff, but they didn't fall to the ground because even gravity was petrified, and so it didn't fall down. That led to a rumor that Bridger could not be trusted. Bridger knew the difference between telling a tall tale, which a lot of us do, and I've heard Jim Hardy tell a few good ones, and many of you others too. There's a difference between that and then telling the truth when you're actually, trying to guide somebody and lives are on the matter. So I was very careful not to put a specific Yellowstone petrified, but there's other things about Yellowstone, like the obsidian. It has a shine like it's glass, and so he has a story based on that. That he saw a deer on the other, and he shot at it, and the deer didn't fall down, and he swore it was only 200 yards away or something like that. And then as he got closer, he realized he was looking through a mountain of glass. And that's a takeoff on the fact that there's a lot of volcanic rock, which, you know, has a shiny appearance. So they're all meant to be humorous and not believed. There's also a story of somebody who was bunking with him. Here's another example of Bridger loving to be out west. When he didn't have an assignment to go with the soldiers, he would sleep on the floor of the storage cabinet or the storage room for the Sutler's store at Fort Laramie. He could have gone home to Kansas City where he had like a 5-bedroom house, but he just wanted to be out there in the West. And I think he wanted to get another job to do some more. So one of his roommates there said that Bridger told the truth, but when people didn't believe him, then he would snarl and walk away from them and, you know, swear a little bit about them, you know, being ignorant people for not believing him. So it got on his nerves after a while because everybody talked about the day they met Jim Bridger, even if they never met Jim Bridger. And that's the way he was. He was a celebrity in that sense.
Thank you very much, Terry.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.